Welcome to Raul Effect, where we uncover the hidden psychology behind love, attachment, and the emotional truths most people never see until it's too late. What if the moment an avoidant believes they've finally won is actually the moment they begin losing themselves? What if an empath's silence isn't rejection, revenge, or punishment, but the mirror that exposes everything they've spent years running from? Stay with me, because tonight we're uncovering why the quietest goodbye often creates the loudest emotional collapse. Tonight I want to share something that many people never notice, not because it's impossible to see, but because people with avoidant tendencies become incredibly skilled at hiding it, even from themselves. We're going to explore why avoidant individuals often begin to unravel emotionally after an empath finally goes silent. Ironically, the moment they believe they've gained control of the situation is often the exact moment their inner stability starts slipping away. Avoidant people and empaths usually exist on opposite ends of the emotional spectrum. An empath naturally feels deeply, connects easily, and openly invests in relationships. An avoidant, on the other hand, has learned to protect themselves by suppressing emotions and keeping people at a comfortable distance. One instinctively moves toward closeness, while the other automatically creates space. At first, this difference can seem complementary. Each appears to balance what the other lacks, creating a relationship that feels strangely complete. But as time passes, that balance slowly turns into emotional strain. The empath keeps showing up with patience, compassion, understanding, and unconditional support, hoping love will slowly lower the avoidant's walls. Meanwhile, the avoidant continues pulling away, protecting their inner world, resisting vulnerability, and relying on distance whenever emotions become uncomfortable. What many people fail to recognize is that an avoidant's emotional collapse rarely begins during an argument or dramatic breakup. It starts much earlier, the moment the empath stops pouring emotional energy into the relationship. Here's the hidden truth. The avoidant often believes they are the one maintaining control, but that sense of control was never entirely their own. It quietly depended on a dynamic they never fully understood. They aren't simply avoiding the relationship, they're avoiding difficult emotions within themselves. The only reason they can continue escaping those feelings without immediately falling apart is because the empath unknowingly absorbs much of the emotional weight. The empath's endless patience, forgiveness, emotional availability, and willingness to understand become a protective cushion. That steady presence shields the avoidant from fully experiencing the consequences of their own emotional distance. As long as the empath keeps giving, the avoidant never has to confront what lies underneath the surface: loneliness, unresolved pain, fear of intimacy, buried childhood wounds, and the insecurities they've spent years keeping hidden. Whether they realize it or not, the empath's emotional presence becomes something the avoidant quietly relies on. It gives them reassurance without requiring vulnerability. It allows them to feel valued without consistently offering the same emotional investment in return. The empath doesn't just love them, they unknowingly help regulate the avoidant's emotional world through consistency, kindness, and unwavering support. After enough time, the avoidant begins treating that stability as permanent. They assume the empath will always remain available, always understand, and always come back after every period of withdrawal. They grow comfortable believing they can keep retreating while someone else keeps reaching toward them. Eventually, however, everything changes. The empath becomes silent, not out of revenge, not to manipulate, not to punish. The silence comes from complete emotional exhaustion. It reflects a quiet realization. I don't have the strength to carry this relationship by myself anymore. At first, the avoidant hardly notices. They assume it's temporary, just another brief pause before everything returns to normal. Their past experiences have taught them that the empath usually comes back. But this time, the silence continues. Slowly, an unfamiliar feeling begins to emerge: instability. The emotional support system they unknowingly depended on is no longer there. Without the empath's steady presence balancing everything, cracks begin forming beneath the surface. This is where the real emotional collapse begins. It doesn't usually happen where everyone can see it. It happens internally. Avoidants often mistake emotional distance for emotional strength. Disconnecting makes them feel safe. Suppressing feelings gives them a sense of control. Shutting people out feels like protection. But once the empath is truly gone, that same emotional distance no longer feels empowering. it begins to feel painfully empty. The isolation they once depended on now exposes everything they spent years trying to escape. For the first time, no one is absorbing the emotions they've been avoiding. No one is softening the impact of their defenses. No one is filling the emotional spaces they refuse to acknowledge. What remains is the reality they've worked so hard to outrun: deep insecurity, unmet emotional needs, fear of closeness, fear of abandonment, unresolved emotional wounds, and questions about their own worth that were never honestly faced. The silence doesn't create these struggles. It simply removes the distraction that kept them hidden. And without the empath's constant emotional presence holding everything together, the avoidant is finally left alone with the parts of themselves they spent years trying not to feel. Everything they buried in the name of being independent begins to rise all at once. The emotions they spent years pushing aside no longer stay hidden. Their emotional defenses slowly weaken under the weight of everything they never allowed themselves to process. This isn't the kind of collapse people usually imagine. It doesn't happen through emotional outbursts or dramatic confrontations. It happens quietly, almost invisibly. Little by little, they begin to notice the absence of the empath in ways they never expected. They feel the missing warmth that once surrounded them. They become aware of the understanding that quietly disappeared. They experience a deep longing for someone they convinced themselves they didn't truly need. Then regret starts to settle in. Sometimes they recognize it immediately, and sometimes it stays beneath the surface. Either way, silence has a way of revealing truths that constant distraction keeps hidden. They slowly realize the empath's love was never something that could easily be replaced. They begin to understand they never had as much control as they believed. Every moment of emotional distance carried consequences they simply refused to acknowledge. Now, without the empath's steady emotional presence, they are left facing themselves. What once felt like safety through withdrawal begins to feel painfully empty. The painful part isn't only losing the relationship, it's losing the emotional stability the empath quietly provided without asking for recognition. They lose the feeling of being accepted, understood, emotionally supported, and valued without having to earn it every day. Once that invisible foundation disappears, the emotional structure they unknowingly depended on starts falling apart. Their struggle isn't simply about missing one person. It's about losing the emotional balance that person helped create. For perhaps the first time in their life, they are left sitting with every feeling they spent years avoiding. Many avoidant people mistake silence for emotional strength. Silence becomes their shield. They use it to escape overwhelming emotions, regain a sense of control, and create distance whenever vulnerability feels unsafe. Over time, silence begins to feel like protection because it has always worked before. The reason it works is simple. Every time they pull away, the empath moves closer. Every time they stop communicating, the empath fills the gap with patience, compassion, reassurance, and understanding. Because silence is repeatedly answered with love, the avoidant starts believing that silence itself gives them power. That illusion lasts only until the empath also becomes quiet. This silence is different. It isn't manipulation. It isn't punishment. It isn't anger. It's the result of emotional exhaustion. Empaths rarely stop trying without reason. They become silent when they realize their words no longer matter, when constant giving starts costing them their own peace, and when love begins to feel more draining than fulfilling. Once that point is reached, everything changes. The silence that once created comfort now creates fear. What once felt like control suddenly feels like loss. The quiet that once offered protection becomes heavy and unsettling. Instead of bringing relief, it creates an emotional pressure that is impossible to ignore. Within that stillness, the avoidant begins to see something they spent years running from. Their silence was never proof of strength. It was fear wearing the mask of control. They had quietly relied on the empath to keep returning. They depended on endless patience, forgiveness, emotional resilience, and the willingness to understand what was never explained. That dependence remained invisible because it existed inside an unhealthy balance that seemed normal. The empath kept adjusting. They kept making sense of emotional distance. They kept turning silence into something survivable. Without realizing it, they became the emotional support system the avoidant never learned to build within themselves. When the empath finally steps back, the entire dynamic shifts. There is no dramatic explosion, no final argument, no loud ending. Instead, something subtle changes. The emotional atmosphere feels different. The avoidant is suddenly left without someone constantly softening the distance between them. No one is regulating the emotional space anymore. In that absence, silence transforms into something completely different. It becomes a mirror, and what that mirror reflects isn't confidence, independence, or emotional control. It reflects the emptiness they spent years avoiding. Not dramatic emptiness, but the quiet realization that without someone else's emotional presence, they struggle to feel internally grounded. The empath's silence exposes a truth they never wanted to face. Their greatest protection was never silence itself. It was having someone who continued loving them despite it. Once that support disappears, they are finally left alone with the emotional reality they spent their entire life trying to escape. What many avoidant people never fully recognize is that their emotional distance was rarely as independent as they believed. The space they created was often supported by someone else who quietly kept the relationship alive. Every time they pulled away, the empath remained present in the background, offering patience, reassurance, affection, and understanding. That steady presence softened the impact of every withdrawal. When that source of emotional support disappears, the avoidant is left face to face with feelings they have spent years keeping buried. Loneliness, regret, insecurity, longing. These emotions don't usually arrive as clear realizations. Instead, they first appear as a strange restlessness, a feeling that something is missing even though nothing obvious has changed. The mind immediately tries to explain it away. I just need more space. This is probably for the best. I'm fine. But the body tells another story. A heavy chest, a knot in the stomach, a constant awareness that something familiar is no longer there. Then the silence begins to feel louder than anything they once escaped, louder than arguments, louder than emotional conversations, louder than the distance they used to create so effortlessly. The difference is simple. Before, they controlled the silence. This time, they don't. They can choose to withdraw. They can stop responding. They can shut people out. But they cannot control what happens when the empath also lets go. That loss of control awakens a fear buried much deeper than they expected, the fear of losing someone who mattered far more than they ever allowed themselves to admit. Many avoidants convince themselves that silence equals strength. They believe emotional distance proves they are unaffected, and that staying detached means staying in control. But the empath's silence quietly destroys that belief, not through confrontation, through absence. Once the empath steps away, the emotional support that quietly held everything together disappears. Without it, memories begin surfacing. At first, they aren't specific events. They are emotional impressions. The countless moments when the empath stayed patient, the times they chose understanding instead of criticism, the moments they reached out after every withdrawal. Those memories no longer feel comforting. They feel unfinished. They carry questions that were never answered and emotions that were never resolved. Gradually, the quiet outside becomes noise inside. The avoidant mind, once skilled at calming itself through distance, now becomes trapped in endless reflection. Did I push them too far? Why didn't they come back this time? Why does this silence feel so different? From the outside, they may still appear composed. They may look calm and emotionally unaffected. But internally, everything has shifted. The emotional system they relied on is no longer stable. Avoidance was never the absence of emotion. It was simply postponing emotion. Feelings were pushed aside until they seemed easier to manage or easier to ignore. But when the empath falls silent, there is nothing left to distract them. No comforting reassurance, no one explaining away the distance, no one protecting the connection alone. Only empty space. And inside that space, every postponed emotion rises together. Fear, guilt, confusion, sadness, longing, emotional pain that was never processed slowly enough to heal. Because those feelings were never acknowledged one by one, they return all at once like a wave that refuses to be ignored. Without realizing it, the avoidant had depended on the empath to help regulate emotions they never learned to face themselves. Now, silence becomes a mirror again. It reflects every emotional wall they built, every moment they justified pulling away, every gap they insisted was necessary, and every consequence they never wanted to examine. Most painful of all, it reveals that they didn't simply lose a relationship. They pushed away the one person who consistently tried to understand them, accepted them through their struggles, and kept choosing connection despite repeated distance. That realization doesn't happen instantly. It unfolds slowly. First comes awareness, then denial, then emotional discomfort, finally reluctant acceptance. Avoidant patterns never erase feelings. They simply postpone them until postponement is no longer possible. Eventually, even their familiar coping strategies stop working. Staying busy no longer brings relief. Emotional detachment loses its effectiveness. Logical explanations stop calming the mind. Even physical distance no longer feels freeing because the emotional bond has already become impossible to ignore. They can no longer blame the empath for caring too much because the empath is no longer there. They can no longer claim they simply needed space because that space now feels painfully empty. What they once called independence begins to feel much closer to emotional isolation. In that unavoidable silence, a deeper truth finally appears. They were never only avoiding the empath, they were avoiding the vulnerable parts of themselves. Silence strips away every excuse. It removes every distraction and every comforting story that allowed emotional avoidance to feel like strength. What remains is honesty. For someone who has built an identity around escaping uncomfortable emotions, that honesty feels like everything inside is falling apart. Nothing outside may have changed, yet internally the weight becomes impossible to ignore. Ordinary moments, a familiar song, a favorite place, even everyday routines begin carrying emotional reminders of what was lost and what was never fully appreciated. This is why the empath's silence becomes such a powerful turning point, not because it punishes, not because it seeks revenge, but because it reveals. It removes the final barrier protecting the avoidant from themselves and leaves only one unavoidable reality: self-confrontation. There is nowhere left to run because the emotions they escaped in the relationship were never separate from the emotions they refused to face within themselves. For years, they leaned on the empath's patience, forgiveness, compassion, and willingness to keep trying. That quiet dependence remained hidden beneath the illusion that they were completely self-sufficient. But once the empath finally lets go, that illusion disappears. The silence no longer feels peaceful. It becomes a mirror reflecting a version of themselves they never expected to meet. And in that reflection, they discover the hardest truth of all. They were never as emotionally independent as they believed. The distance they called strength had always been supported by someone else's love. Now that support is gone. What remains are the feelings they spent their entire life trying to outrun: loneliness, insecurity, longing, and regret. The silence becomes more intense than any argument they ever tried to escape. It feels heavier than emotional confrontation and far more unsettling than the distance they once created so effortlessly. The difference is that this time they are no longer the one deciding when the silence begins or ends. They can still pull away. They can still shut down, but they cannot make the empath return and restore the connection the way they once expected. That loss of control awakens something much deeper than discomfort. It exposes an old fear that has always lived beneath the surface, the fear that if no one is reaching for them anymore, perhaps they were never as emotionally important as they believed. For years, many avoidants mistake being pursued for being secure. When someone keeps coming back, they feel valued. When someone continues forgiving them, they feel protected. As long as another person keeps closing the emotional gap, they believe the relationship will always survive their distance. Eventually, they begin expecting love to follow the same pattern. They withdraw, someone follows. They create space, someone else fills it. They remain emotionally unavailable, and another person keeps carrying the relationship. But everything changes when the empath becomes silent. This silence isn't a strategy. It isn't an attempt to provoke a reaction or pull them back. It comes from peace. And that is exactly why it feels so unsettling. Peace doesn't argue. It doesn't beg. It doesn't keep explaining itself. It simply stops investing where the effort is no longer shared. For the avoidant, that realization is deeply unsettling. They are no longer being chased, not because they're being punished, but because the relationship has reached its natural limit. This is where the emotional collapse quietly begins. Being pursued wasn't only attention, it became part of how they measured their worth. It allowed them to feel important without exposing their own vulnerability. Once that pursuit disappears, an uncomfortable question appears in its place. What if I'm no longer the person they choose? That thought slowly weakens the emotional walls they spent years building. They begin realizing that silence was never real strength. It only worked because someone else stayed longer than they should have. The empath's quiet withdrawal communicates something words never could. I can't keep repairing a relationship that only one of us is trying to protect. That message reaches deeper than anger ever could because anger still carries emotional attachment. Peace signals completion. Without the empath's reassurance, patience, or constant emotional support, the avoidant loses the external stability they quietly depended on. Suddenly, there is nothing left to soften what they've spent years avoiding. Fear, regret, loneliness, confusion, emotional hunger. These feelings don't arrive one at a time. They surface together because they were postponed instead of processed. Silence becomes unbearable, not because nothing is happening, but because everything they buried is finally asking to be felt. It reflects every emotional wall they justified, every moment they chose distance over closeness, and every consequence they never allowed themselves to fully acknowledge. Most painful of all, they begin seeing the relationship differently. They didn't lose someone who failed to love them. They lost someone who kept loving them while they repeatedly stepped away. That realization doesn't explode outward, it settles inward. Old memories return with new meaning. The patience they overlooked now feels rare. The kindness they dismissed now feels priceless. They remember someone who never expected perfection, only presence. And presence was the one thing they struggled to give. By this stage, their usual defenses stop working. Emotional detachment no longer brings relief. Logic cannot silence the discomfort. Distraction loses its power because the emotional bond has already awakened inside them. Eventually, they understand the truth they spent years avoiding. They weren't only avoiding the empath, they were avoiding their own vulnerability. Silence removes every excuse, every distraction, and every comforting story they told themselves. What's left is an honest reflection of who they became inside the relationship. That is why the empath's silence becomes the true turning point. Not because it seeks revenge, but because it reveals reality. In the end, what looked like emotional strength was often emotional avoidance, supported by someone else's endless patience. They believed distance would always feel safe because someone else kept returning to close the gap. When that finally stops, the illusion disappears. They are left alone with everything they postponed, buried fears, unresolved pain, loneliness, regret, and the realization that distance never protected them from suffering. It only delayed facing it. The empath's silence becomes the final mirror. It doesn't simply reveal who the empath was. It reveals who the avoidant became while hiding behind emotional distance. And that is where the real collapse happens. Not because love vanished, but because the belief that love would always keep chasing them finally comes to an end. In the quiet that follows, one truth becomes impossible to escape. The relationship wasn't lost in a single moment. It slowly unraveled every time fear replaced presence and emotional avoidance replaced genuine connection. Once that truth settles in, the silence is no longer temporary. It becomes final. The greatest pain isn't losing someone who loved you. It is realizing too late what that love was truly worth. The empath's silence doesn't create the avoidance collapse. It simply reveals the emotions that were hidden all along. True healing begins the moment we stop running from ourselves because the deepest connection we can ever build starts with emotional honesty. If this video gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our future videos. Share this with someone who needs to hear this message today, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching Raul Effect. I'll see you in the next video.